Welcome to the PRCA's podcast, Fuse, the global podcast for PR, marketing and communication professionals. Our special guest is Paul Gerrard, the campaign's public affairs and board secretariat director at the Co-op. Now, a little bit about Paul before I welcome him. He has had almost 20 years in the civil service, working in tax, customs and excise, and the Home Office. Paul joined the Co-op, the world's oldest cooperative business, in 2016. As Campaigns and Public Affairs Director, he leads the Co-op's engagement with the government across all their interests on a range of public policy issues. He also leads their campaigning activity through their multi-award-winning campaigns on modern slavery, loneliness, and their current campaign on shop worker violence and crime in the community. He is a trustee of the Cooperative Heritage Trust. Welcome, Paul.
Hiya, very nice to be here. Very kind of you to have me on the podcast.
Fantastic. So what I wanted to start with, Paul, is just, to understand a little bit about your typical work day. So how does your typical day start and finish? And I'd also love to know how you consume news as well. As PRs, we have to constantly horizon scan. So yeah, how's your typical day?
It starts pretty early. I tend to be an early riser, so I'll get up, I'll start to listen to some podcasts while I'm making myself a coffee, while I'm making my wife a coffee. If it's my turn to take my son to school, then I'll do that, and then I get into the day proper. The day will be meetings, lots of conversations. Interestingly, most of those will be external to the Co-op, but I also make sure that throughout the day I have some thinking time. That often means writing time, because often I think through writing, and I've always tried to protect that time, because otherwise you're just back to back in meetings. You end up being a bit of a busy fool. In terms of how I consume news, I still like a good newspaper, as well as the dedicated news channels. But as I mentioned before, I love a podcast or two. I think the BBC does some great podcasts, particularly Westminster Hour and The Week in Westminster. And then, I think X or Twitter or whatever it's called this week is a useful way to just keep on terms of on top of breaking news. So whatever I can get hold of, and I can fit around whatever I'm doing that particular time and day. Fantastic.
And I completely hear you about carving out time to write, because I just find when there's multiple meetings throughout the day, it interrupts your sort of train of thought that enables you to be able to write coherently. So it's so important to have those boundaries in place. Now, the Japanese, they have a concept, ikigai, and what I wanted to understand from your perspective, because obviously to join the civil service as well as the Co-op, I wanted to understand your sort of personal meaning of life in relation to your talents, passions, professions. So your sort of, your mission, as it were.
Well, there's some days, Farzana, where I'm a bit of a fan of Northern Soul, and there's a great line in Northern Soul that's keep on keeping on, and sometimes it's just a case of the meaning of life at that point is just to get to the end of that particular day, and I think we'll all recognise that. I guess more seriously, I am very aware that whatever I've achieved in my life to date, I've done because of other people supporting me, giving me a chance, showing me kindness and generosity. And so I'd say what makes me get out of bed every morning is the idea that I can help the community that brought me up, and in which my son and daughter will grow up, try and make that a better place. I've always also been really attracted to the idea of solidarity, standing with people, because I think one of the most powerful things any human being can do is stand with someone who needs it. So I think making the community that I live in a better one, and standing in solidarity with people who need that support, I think are the two things that come to mind.
Very inspiring, Paul. As I was researching you, I stumbled across a PR Week article, and it's actually about stammering as a public affairs professional. And I just wanted to read out a little from it, which really struck me. In many ways, the job I do is a nightmare for someone with speech impediment. I'm making speeches, doing interviews on TV, and giving evidence to parliamentary select committees. Speaking is literally my job. And what I wanted to, understand from yourself, for for those who are listening who have an impediment to their sort of their day-to-day job, how did you overcome it? You mentioned very touchingly about your mum, that gave you that support. But yeah, just for our listeners to hear your story in having a speech impediment and yet being all over the news, and speaking is literally your job. So yeah.
It is. I mean, we're recording this on a Wednesday. I've already done 10 broadcast media interviews, half of them live. So it literally is what I do every day. Well, I come from a family of stammers. My late mum stammered, my sister does. And it's something as you get old, you start to accept it as part of who you are, and it's nothing to be ashamed of or to hide. I was really lucky in that my late mum was an absolute force of nature, not just for me, but for my two brothers and my sister. And she wouldn't let anything get in the way of that. And actually, what I do now to manage that is actually what my mum told me the first time I ever spoke in public. The first time I ever did any kind of public speaking was I was doing the first reading at our local church. I'm a local church in Anderton called St Joseph's, and I was doing the first reading. And my mum said to me, "Right, Paul, practice. Pick out me." She's always sat on the right hand side on the Lady Chapel. Look at me and shout the first word. And so I'm stood there, I think I was 9 years old, and I did this. So I thought, right, I knew this reading off by heart. It was St. Paul, I have fought the good fight. I got up on the lectern, I looked at my mum and I shouted the first word, except for my mum nor I had remembered that there was microphones in the church. So when I shouted the first word, it literally shocked everyone because it reverberated around the entire church. But actually, what my mum told me 40 odd years ago was right. Practice, focus on something and attack the first word. It's always the first word that gets me. It's always the hello, hiya, whatever it is. You attack the first word. And I think that's got me through. But I think the other thing that is that I'm acutely aware of the responsibility I have. You do not see people in the public realm speaking who have stammers. You just don't. You don't see, the ones that you do are people who are objects of fun. It'll be, Ronnie Barker in Open All Hours, or it'd be people who you laugh at because they have a stammer. And so as I've got older and realised that I am on TV a lot and I am on radio and I do public speaking, it's important that there'll be people out there who stammer like me and they have a worse stammer than me, or any other kind of speech impediment. And so people seeing people like them will remind them that there isn't a barrier. The only barrier is your ability and your attitude. It's not about whether you stammer or have a speech impediment or anything else. So I think there's a responsibility on people like me who've been lucky enough to get where I've got to not be ashamed of it and not try and hide it and not try and dodge it. It is me, and that's what you get if you want to speak to me.
Incredible, absolutely incredible. I always find public speaking terrifying, and so it's And do you still feel nervous before you go on, or actually is it so so sort of easy for you that it's like breathing now?
No, I always prep. I always have talking points ready. Interesting when I'm doing the media stuff. If it's a pre-record, I find that a bit harder because there's no adrenaline. So I did the Today program earlier this week, and that was live, and that was fine because you get the adrenaline. And it's like, oh right. So as my mum used to say to me, you attack the first word, and that's fine. When you're doing a pre-record, you don't quite have that adrenaline. And you've got to think of a word that you can get out easy and start off. So no, but I always get nervous, and I think if I didn't get nervous, I wouldn't be being me, and I wouldn't probably be a particularly effective public speaker because that adrenaline, those nerves can help you sort of have the energy that I think you need in your voice.
Yeah. So leads me on to my next question about the you obviously you did a PhD,
Yes.
and you did a PhD on nuns.
I did. I'm a good Catholic, Irish on my mum's side, Old English on my dad's side. And I did a degree, a history degree, which was predominantly ended up being about medieval history and about popes, nuns, monks, etc. And then it was just to do a PhD, and I ended up doing a PhD on the Order of the Poor Clares, who were the female Franciscan order, St. Francis of Assisi, founded by St. Clare of Assisi in 1216. And it was an unusual one because it was a modern church history. It was about how they've changed the last 6 years. So what it meant was I got to travel around a lot of Europe and write and speak to people from across the world. nuns, and how they've lived their life, and they're the most inspirational people I have still ever met. They are remarkable human beings who have got a optimism about the world, an optimism about the human condition that I think is infectious. And even now, the poor Clares are extremely dear to my heart.
Gosh, and Paul, that's quite a segue to joining the civil service. And I understand from reading up about your background, you joined the fast stream, and the fast stream at the civil service, only 1% of the fast stream at the time, people came from a working class background, and I just wanted to understand a little bit about. How, is that still the same at the civil service? Obviously, I know that you've left, but do you still have an underrepresentation of people from working class backgrounds in the civil service, and in particular in the fast stream? And the second, what I really wanted to understand is your working class background. Irish Catholic from Lancashire. Your father delivered coals, to homes. How did that impact your ability to navigate the civil service? I mean, of course, you did incredibly well and reached incredibly senior positions across multiple areas within the civil service. But I just wanted to understand about about your working class background and how that shaped your experience.
I had a wonderful upbringing. I've got a wonderful family. I come from a very close-knit community in Lancashire, where everybody knew everybody and we looked out for each other. And I went to school with the brothers and sisters of my brothers and sisters. Our mum and dad made sure we never wanted for anything emotionally or materially. It was a good, solid, working class Catholic on my mum's side, Catholic, Irish on my mum's side. My dad was a coal man, mum was a homemaker and did a few jobs around the edges. I was very fortunate in that at 11 I won a scholarship to go to an independent school, which means I got an education that someone from my background would never have been able to afford. I think that education really helped me. When I joined the fast stream in May '97, I've been in the Home Office previously. I joined the fast stream element of the Home Office of the civil service. About 1% of the intake that in that period was from a working class background. Even now, only 18% of senior civil servants are from working class backgrounds. Now, if I compare that to my own co-op now, 33% of a similar cohort are from working class backgrounds. So the civil service is still underrepresented, in my view, in terms of class. I guess how did it make me feel? I remember going to a course for the fast stream when the civil service fast stream used to run courses out in Sunningdale near Ascot. And we were having a drink in after the first set of lectures. And I was chatting away to someone. And they said, "What does your dad do?" He was a perfect nice fellow. We were having a chat. I said, "What does your dad do?" He said, "Well, he's a coal man." To which his answer was, "Oh, how many mines does he own?" Like, no, he delivers coal. He doesn't own mines. And that is no criticism of the fellow speaking to. He was a perfect nice guy. But I guess what it brought home to me was that there were a lot of these people that I was on the fast stream with who've now become senior civil servants as I became and directors as I became and more senior DG and PermSec, who were from a background which means that there was an expectation that one of my old colleagues said that they were born to rule. And I think there was something about that gives them confidence. Certainly I felt slightly ill at ease amongst those senior civil servants. And even when I was a peer or more senior than some of those characters, I still did, because they had a confidence that their voice had value. And I wasn't sure mine ever did. And even now, and I'm 51 now, Farzana, and I've done plenty. There's still a little voice on my shoulder that says, "Why do you want to hear from the kid from the terrace house in Lancashire East Hammers? Just keep your mouth shut." So I think that's still there a bit. And that sense of confidence, as much as entitlement, was with my colleagues. And, there were some wonderful people. And I think background shouldn't matter, but there needs to be a diversity of background. And when only 1 in 5 of the most senior decision makers in government are from a working class background, that's not diverse.
No, absolutely. However, you spent almost 20 years in the civil service. I wanted to understand a little bit about why you decided to leave the civil service. and also, really interested. We have Nolan's 7 principles: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. And was introduced 4 standards in public life. From your time in the civil service, did you feel that those principles were something that civil servants really did abide by? And do you think that you witnessed some sort of cultural change during your time at the civil service?
Yeah, so, I loved being a civil servant. I'm enormously proud of what myself and my colleagues achieved, and I'm the most robust defender of the civil service. I don't think the civil service get anything like the credit they deserve. I guess I left partly personal. My daughter at the time was 12, my son was 3. I was spending a lot of time on the train to London, and then staying in London. I was missing growing them up. I was missing spending time with my wife. So there was a personal bit that said, I want to be based in Manchester. But also, if I'm honest, professionally, this was sort of 2015, 2016. We were 5 years into austerity. I felt that the heart of our public services was being ripped out, and that people's lives, and often the most vulnerable in our society, were being harmed by that. And I didn't want to be a part of that. Now, I absolutely strongly believe, and this comes back down to some of the Nolan principles in the Civil Service Code, that if a civil servant doesn't agree with the direction of a government, then it's for the civil servant to either suck it up or leave. Because ultimately, government ministers have a mandate from the UK population. They won a general election. I've never stood for election. I've got no mandate. So once I realised that I felt too uncomfortable with that direction of travel that the government of the day were following, it was time for me to leave. It wasn't for them to change. It was for me to either suck it up or leave. I think the Nolan principles were relevant in 1996, 97 when I joined the civil service. I think they're even more relevant now, because I do think our politics is polarised, it's fragmented, at times it's fundamentally broken. And I can look back at my time in the civil service, and there were lots of times where both officials and ministers have fallen short. Has it changed? So I'm not in the civil service anymore. I know lots of people who are, and I work with civil servants almost every day of the week. And I see in the civil servants of today the same things that I saw in the fantastic colleagues that I work with. There's an intellectual robustness and curiosity that I think is really important. I think there's a public service ethos about making the society that they're living in better. So I still see the same qualities in civil servants now. I think it's probably a harder job now, because I think there's been a period of time over the last few years where ministers have attacked civil servants. They've eroded the reputation of civil servants. And I think that affects the relationship between civil servants and the ministers that they support. The loyalty and trust which should be a given, at times that's become pretty fractious. And that's dangerous. It's especially dangerous for the civil service, actually, because if a minister can't trust their civil servants, then you're in a bad place. So I think it's harder to be a civil servant now. I think they're just as capable now as when I joined in 1996-97. But I think there is something about, I was in HMRC and Customs Excise before that. HMRC during the pandemic nationalised the British payroll. That kept money coming into people's pockets when they couldn't work because of the lockdowns. Civil servants in HMRC did that from their bedrooms and from their kitchen tables, and they made a huge contribution. And I don't think that's been recognised enough. And I think the more politicians can recognise the value of civil servants and the value of the work that they do, then you'll have a better relationship.
I mean, the civil service, they haven't been shy at clapping back, have they? I mean, you had the famous or infamous tweet, arrogant and offensive, that came out from the UK Civil Service Twitter account. Can you imagine having to work with these truth twisters? So they're not particularly shy, and they're, and it's a sort of a departure from the yes minister caricature of passive aggressive civil servants to actually tweeting out. What were your thoughts about that tweet? I mean, it just went absolutely viral, and I must say it just made me laugh, and I still laugh thinking about it.
Yeah, so it made me laugh. I bought a tea towel with the tweet on it that I've got framed. Look, I mean, I've worked with politicians and elected representatives for my whole 25-year professional career. And there have been some true twisters. And there have also been some true twisters in the civil service, by the way. But what I would say is that some of the finest public servants I can think of, and I have met more than most people, were government ministers. Government ministers who were dedicated to trying to improve the society in which they lived and the people that they represented. And I think the idea that all politicians are truth twisters or arrogant, I just think he's slightly cockeyed, and he's lacking in self-awareness, because there's plenty. I think there's been a series of events over the last few years where I don't think civil servants have remembered accountability and remembered what they're there for. And I think those small number of occasions have let down the vast majority of civil servants who are fantastic public servants. So, I guess the other thing I would say is, look, I had plenty of frank conversations with ministers, but it was always in the context, be those ministers Labour or Conservative, that they knew that once they'd heard my advice, whether they liked it or not, and once they'd come to a decision, because they decide, civil servants advise, that I would get on with implementing, as long as it was legal, or they knew that it wasn't legal. My job was to implement what the elected government of the day was there to do. And as I said, if you don't agree with that as a civil servant, honestly, it is time to leave.
Yeah, and that was, I imagine that was your red line, was the austerity cuts and feeling compromised working in the civil service. You obviously moved on to public affairs. Now, and I think that's quite interesting how you went into sort of public affairs after working at the civil service, because of your frustration around the austerity cuts, and actually, public affairs serves to influence policy. So you sort of left civil service in order to be at the driving seat of influencing and shaping public policy. How would you describe public affairs? And I imagine you also experienced the same lack of working class representation when you entered into the PA realm.
Yeah, I mean, what is public affairs is a good question. And actually, if you get 10 public affairs professionals in a room, you'll get 15 different views as to what the answer to that question is. I think, look, at its most basic, public affairs is about seeking to influence government policy positions and the legislative programme. It's lobbying. And lobbying is a word that often has negative connotation when they come to that. So certainly, I think public affairs, like the senior level, why did I enter public affairs? The public affairs is about influencing government policy and legislative agenda. Well, I spent 20 years doing that. I understand how Parliament works, how government works, how politics works. So, I have a set of skills and experience that means that I can do that. Certainly, public affairs is slightly male, about 55% male. It's quite young, 60% under 35. 2/3 actually don't have children. It's quite London-based, 60% is London, although that's beginning to change with the devolved administrations and the regional mayoralties. And at least half have a master's degree. It's also true for public affairs that 2/3 of public affairs professionals had parents who had degrees. Yeah. And 70% of public affairs professionals don't think that where they work is very diverse in terms of class. Now, that's data from the PRCA Public Affairs Census last year. And I think I see that because I think it's a very graduate-based programme. I'm not sure the pathways into public affairs that aren't graduate-based. And I think it's also, if can you afford to live and work in London? And that's pretty difficult if you're going to be if you're from a background where you've not got, your family or others can't give you the kind of support. So I think it's changing a bit, but yeah, it felt quite like the senior civil service. It was it wasn't that diverse.
And why do you think lobbying has such a bad reputation? And, you've obviously, it's your world, and, I'm sure most people working in public affairs want to see an improvement in the reputation for lobbying. So I'd love to know from your perspective, why do you think it has a bad reputation? What can be done to improve the reputation of public affairs? And do you think the current legislation is fit for purpose?
Well, I think lobbying does have a bad reputation. I think the reason it has a bad reputation is that every so often there's a scandal. It could be Greensill, it could be Cash for Questions. You can go on and on. Every decade has its scandal, and therefore lobbying is never about, oh, look, that lobbyist helped to create really good legislation. It's also always about that lobbyist did X, so it could be green seal, so it could be cash for questions. I think the truth is that lobbyists is a pretty broad term. It includes charities who lobby. It includes trade unions that lobby as much as it includes businesses that lobby. And I think that lobbying is a vital part of our democracy because what they do is when done properly and when done with a set of standards and ethics, they bring views and data into the policy-making process. Now, as a former civil servant, I know that you make good policy and indeed law when you have the most diverse, most comprehensive set of evidence and data. But the truth is the government has limited budgets and can't always afford to get that data or that insight. And I think where lobbyists can add real value is by bringing into the policy-making process evidence that can help make better policy. That's when lobbyists are good. That's when lobbyists make a real positive difference. And that's been my experience both inside and outside government. So in terms of is the legislation fit for purpose, Farzana? Well, I think there's two bits to this. The 2014 Act is pretty narrow in terms of who it covers. It only covers agency lobbyists, now. So that wouldn't include me because I'm an in-house lobbyist for the co-op group. It also is quite narrow in terms of who's being lobbied. It's only ministers or senior civil servants. Well, I'm trying to remember the numbers. I think the senior civil service is 0.2% of the entire civil service. So it's pretty narrow. The other thing I think probably more powerful for public affairs professionals are the codes of conduct of the professional bodies like the PRCA. And I think that their guidance on ethics and behaviour is the one that can really help guide public affairs professionals. Does the legislative framework need to change? I think there's always a danger that legislators, i.e. parliamentarians, will find the solution to be legislation because that's what they do. And, I'm sure there are ways it can be improved. For me, it's more about implementation. It's more about holding to account people and making sure that they are following the legislation even as it stands. I think it is as important as new legislation.
You mentioned, obviously, in terms of having public affairs practitioners, it's not just big business, which is kind of often the sort of archetypal understanding from the public, but also charities. But fundamentally, businesses will have a lot more resource to allocate on public affairs compared to a cash-strapped charity. So there is an inequity of, for many who can't afford public affairs, and therefore, the sort of logic is they can't therefore shape policy. What advice would you give to those who do not have the resources to hire a public affairs agency or, in-house experts who want to campaign for change?
I mean, you're absolutely right, Farzana, that, why did the co-op want me to go and work for them? It's because I understand government, parliament and politics. Spent 20 years doing it. Therefore, I can bring that expertise. Two observations. One is, if I think of the work that we've done on our campaigns, what's really powerful is where you have people who wouldn't normally sit next to each other, sat next to each other on the other side of a table from a government minister or senior civil servant, saying the same thing. So if I think what we did on slavery, yes, it was the co-op, but it was a co-op, and more important than that, actually, it was 20 charities, often very small charities, who represent slavery survivors and work with slavery survivors. So I think there's something about charities creating allies of businesses, so businesses can bring their assets, which, as you say, may be resource, but also then can bring what the charity has, which is real frontline experience, bring the voices of the individuals who would be the beneficiaries of any changes. So I think there's something about partnership that can help. If you're an individual and you want to see change, I would suggest that everyone remembers that fundamentally MPs are not just legislators, but they are local representatives. They're elected by constituents. So my advice would be that if you're passionate about a subject, get in touch with your local MP. Find others in your area who think the same. Get them to get in touch with their MP. And ideally, find people across the country who can get in touch with their local MP. There are MPs that I can think of who are the most phenomenal campaigners. One that comes to mind would be Carolyn Harris, who's the MP down in Swansea. What Carolyn has done, particularly for child bereavement, is just remarkable. And that's an individual MP. She's an individual MP, Carolyn. And I think if you can join forces with an MP like that, it's remarkable what you can achieve. So I think it's all about creating alliances and partnerships. So you each bring what you've got together. You'll deliver more than you will individually.
I think that there's a really good point, because I think one of the barriers to entry is lack of expertise and cost, and the ability to sort of mobilize. And actually, in the age of the internet, you can find case studies and best practice and templates and guides. So the expertise, you can actually find some very sort of relevant information online. And also, of course, it's relatively free for those with sort of internet connection and a sort of a mobile or computer to set up communication channels. And I think one positive aspect of social media is that you can actually create like-minded groups and
Absolutely.
find them from not only across the country but around the world. So I think it's much more open than it was before for those who do not have the sort of the budgets and the expertise. Now, you left the civil service, and out of all the organisations, you decided to join the co-op. So I wanted to know why. Why co-op? I wanted to understand a little bit about the history of the co-op, and also the similarities and differences between co-op and John Lewis.
Certainly. So the co-op group, who I work for, and there are 7,000 co-ops in the country, but I work for the co-op group. We are the oldest co-op in the world. We trace our roots back to Rochdale in 1844. I was in New York speaking on slavery for the co-op about 5 or 6 years ago. And as I was walking from the UN building back to the hotel, I saw a bus stop that had a sign that said Co-op Town and Rochdale Village. I thought, what's that? And when I Googled it, the biggest housing association in New York is a co-op, and its municipal centre is called Rochdale, after Rochdale. And that's who I work for. I work for the co-op group. Yeah, the co-op group is what the Rochdale pioneers, who were founded in 1844, became. As I said, we're one of 7,000 in the UK. There are 3 million co-ops worldwide. People don't understand that. Co-ops are one of the oldest and one of the most widespread business models. And critically for any cooperative, I think this is the key thing, co-ops are owned and operated for the benefit of their members. So in the UK, the co-op group who I work for has over 4.5 million members. Our job is to create value for them because they're our owners. You can only ever own one share in a co-op. No matter how much money you have, you can't buy more shares. It's not like a PLC where if you buy 51% of the shares, you run the business. You can't in a co-op. It's a democracy. You can only ever own one share. So when I decided it was time for me to move on from the civil service, I was on the high potential development program, and I was offered a secondment, which I took. And it was with the co-op, which worked for me because the co-op is Manchester based, and me and my family, my wife and kids, we live in Manchester, so it worked fine. Halfway through that secondment, I thought, yeah, it's time for me to go out. It's time for me to do something different that isn't the civil service. And I spoke to a number of businesses, management consultancies in particular, and there's some great businesses and they do some great things. But when the co-op found out I was leaving the civil service, and they said, well, actually, why don't you stay with us? And they offered me a role. I absolutely jumped at that. And I guess the reason I jumped at it is partly it was Manchester based, and therefore it gave me that work-life balance, which is really important. But it was more than that. It was the alignment with the values. All those 3 million co-ops worldwide share a set of values and principles, first articulated in Rochdale by the Rochdale pioneers in 1844. And I could see alignment between the co-op's values and my values. And I think that's really important. That's one of my red lines. I couldn't work for a business where ultimately I didn't see a alignment of values. Now, you might not agree with every decision because you can interpret what that value might mean on a particular issue, but you've broadly got to agree with the ethos of the organisation. And for co-ops who believe in equality and equity and democracy and solidarity and concern for community, we've been doing that for almost 180 years, I could see an alignment. Now, John Lewis are a mutual rather than a co-op, but they have many features that you would associate at first glance with a worker co-op. I guess the biggest difference for us is we are owned by our 4.5 million members. John Lewis are owned by their employees, their partners. But actually, we share a lot of the same value set around what we're trying to do and the difference that we can make. And certainly as a mutual, they are very much fellow travellers with co-ops and with social enterprises. So yeah, we're cut from the same cloth, I would suggest.
One of the many campaigns that you have been spearheading is the anti-trafficking and modern slavery campaign. And congratulations, first of all, on being named a few years back on the top 100 for human trafficking and slavery campaigners. And I wanted to understand a little bit about sort of Bright Future campaign, and also it's become relatively recent, the awareness of modern slavery, and many people sort of felt it was something that belonged in the past. And as part of the campaign been the awareness that actually it exists, and it's not something that happens in just foreign lands and previous centuries.
Yeah, so we ran the campaign from about 2016-17 through to 2021, and I did receive some post recognition of that. But I think more important than that, the co-op became the first British business ever to receive the Thomson Reuters Global Stop Slavery Award. Previous winners have been Hewlett Packard and Adidas, and we were awarded that because of the Bright Future program. And what Bright Future was, we ended up working with almost every slavery charity that supports slavery survivors in the UK. And what they told us was, and probably there are many horrific facts to do with slavery. The last data I looked at, there are, if you take a town like Blackpool or Worcester, there's that many, there are 135,000 people in slavery in the UK today. So that's a town the size of Blackpool or Worcester. There's lots of horrific stories. But one of the most horrific or depressing was that when slavery survivors are rescued or escape, very many end up going back to the person who enslaved them. So what does that mean? They go back to the farm. They go back to the house where they've been a domestic slave. They go back to the brothel where they've been multiply raped every single day. And you think, why would they do that? Well, the reason they do that is that they can't make it without that support. And actually, what changes fundamentally the risk of trafficking is paid employment. Because paid employment not just gives the slavery survivor respect, it gives them dignity, it gives them control. And fundamentally, slavery is about a loss of control. But of course, if you've been enslaved for 18 months, 2 years, 7 years, then actually, and you will bring with you the scars from that, both mental and physical, so sometimes. Finding a job can be quite difficult. Getting used to the world of paid work, where you are respected and treated properly, can be difficult, and many slavery survivors struggle with that. So what we did in the co-op is work with first a couple of charities, a charity called City Heart at the time, I think they're called Causeway now, and a charity called the Snowdrop Foundation. And we worked a way to find a way to help those slavery survivors come in, have a fully paid, essentially probation for 4 weeks with us, have a job interview, and if they pass the interview, they got a full-time job. So this wasn't charity. We weren't doing them a favour. We were giving them an opportunity. And what we had to do is create a model that provided them support and provided support to our managers who had to deal with people who sometimes, were really facing into some difficult things. It worked, and we thought, that's great. The co-op's done something good, but actually, just us doing that isn't. Not everyone wants to work in a co-op store, a co-op warehouse. So I think one of the things we did, and this is what I'm most proud of, is that we took the Bright Future program and said, right, okay, we want every charity in the country to be part of this, and we ended up just about they all were. But we want other businesses. This isn't about the co-op saying, we've done something great, let's keep it to ourselves and let's sort of feel good about ourselves. Who else can we bring in? So we brought in other co-op societies. We brought in businesses like Dixon's Carphone Warehouse. We brought in food production facilities. I think we ended up with about 23 other businesses involved. So what does that mean? It means that wherever you were in the country, if you were ready and able to work and had the legal ability to work, we could match you into a role that might meet your ambitions. And suddenly you've got slavery survivors being given choices. I remember speaking to one of our colleagues who had been enslaved through car washes. He was basically locked up in a 40-foot container overnight. He was let out to run the car wash, then he was put back in the container, and he escaped. And he worked with us, and he was fantastic. I remember talking to him. I said, just making chat, and he said, I said, what did you do at the weekend? He said, oh, I went to Amsterdam. I said, oh, did you? Yeah. He said, I've got engaged to my girlfriend. I said, brilliant. And he said, but I couldn't have done that without this job because I didn't have that control. In fact, he met his fiancée in the co-op. They were work part, and interestingly, I'm not quite sure the co-op would want to be the Cilla Black of this kind of thing, but in effect we were. And I think that's one of the most, and that's really interesting because what that is, touched on before, charities and businesses working together, partnerships, a frontal into business. And then the other thing that we did as an asset is we really started to talk about slavery. So we did work with The Sun, and The Sun newspaper ran a series of very hard-hitting conversations. We worked with Lord Ian McCall at the time, who was trying to take legislation through the House. We financially supported a number of slavery charities, including the Sophie Hayes Foundation. We did some fantastic work to help slavery become an issue and become known and understood. And again, I think our role was to support those slavery charities who support survivors. It wasn't about the co-op; it was about those. And I think we did a good job for them, and I think we helped them.
I guess it's about widening the tent, and I think what it sounds like is you and your team play the role of a conductor and bringing in the media and other businesses and charities and ensuring that everyone's sort of singing from the same hymn sheet. And I think that's what really raises awareness and sort of in public consciousness is when actually there's multiple different areas within society are all campaigning and providing solutions as well.
One of the just to complete that, the Rights Lab, which is in the University of Nottingham, it's one of the world's leading academic institutions on slavery. They did a review of our campaign. It was an independent review. They could, they have academic integrity anyway, so it always would be. But they reviewed it, and it was called Campaigning for Change. And if you Google the Rights Lab Campaigning for Change, and what it talked about was an assets-based approach by businesses. What can businesses do to use all the assets they've got on an issue? And one of our assets, as you absolutely touched on it, our ability to convene people. Bring them together to try to work together.
Yeah, and that's incredibly powerful when done successfully. One of your very, very high profile campaigns, and this is how I heard of you before, was the campaign around the sort of the Retail Crime Act, and all of a sudden I just saw my social media just flooded with user generated content about I saw this man or this girl at my sort of local store and and they've just stolen something, and what was incredible was that sense of sort of citizenship all of a sudden using social media, that sense of sort of public outrage of the breakdown of society and that empathy as well for the employees that are on the front line that that have to often deal with the conflict and the lack of sort of the police turning up when a sort of a shoplifting crime's been reported. I just wanted to understand now this has obviously been going on for decades, longer. What triggered this particular campaign, and what outcomes did you have in mind when you were planning the campaign? The impact was huge. I mean, not only in terms of, it was all over the media and social media, and you actually got the public engaged, but also it led to legislative changes with the Retail Crime Act. Were you surprised by the success of the campaign? I'd love to know just the strategy behind the campaign and whether or not you surprised yourself.
So we've campaigned on different elements of this for about 5 or 6 years now. We started back in 2018 around violence and abuse, and we got the law changed in 2021 in Scotland, so it's now a standalone offence to attack a shop worker, and we got attacking a shop worker to be an aggravated offence in 2021 in England and Wales. The latest bit that you have seen, Farzana, was really around the increase in crime in stores, but critically, the increase in crime in stores being driven by organised criminality. Now, my background in customs and excise was in law enforcement. I was responsible for tackling organised crime, attacking the excise system, cigarettes, alcohol, oils, nationwide. something I understand. What we saw was a 43% increase in the first 9 months of this year, for example, in the number of crimes in our stores. And that being driven by a relatively small number of prolific offenders who weren't stealing to feed themselves, they were stealing to resell on scale.
So it wasn't opportunistic, it became organised.
No, it was absolutely. So they would come in and they would bring in a huge hold all and they'd take out the entire meat section, they'd take out the entire spirit section, the entire confectionery section, the household cleaning products. And what came with that level of brazenness and that level of determination by these individuals and gangs, often armed, was that you had abuse has gone up by 40%. A third of that will be hate-related abuse. Violence has gone up 35% so far this year. And so we decided in sort of the early summer that we needed to start to campaign again on this. And in particular, what drove us was the co-op spends 4 times the sector average on security measures to keep colleagues safe and shops safe. But what we were seeing is that the police response was really poor. Now, I'm not going to deliberately go out and denigrate the police because I'm a former law enforcement officer. My brother was a former police sergeant. But the truth is that they weren't prioritising it. So what we tried to do is we tried to do a couple of things. Number one, a great campaign often has, did you know? Did you know it's gone up 43%? Did you know? And we use CCTV footage. One of the things we did really well, so we got data out there. We did a freedom of information request that said the police don't turn up in 70% of the times. So we did data. We did both our data and the police's own data. We had images and CCTV of literally looting, because that's what this is. And then lastly, we had often, although I did a lot of the media, you often had colleagues doing the media, colleagues explaining. I remember being on LBC with Nick Ferrari. I did a bit, and one of my colleagues from London, store manager from London, had explain what her personal experience was. So the combination of data, images, and then pure colleague experience really got traction. I think it got traction at the time because there was also this conversation about are the police tackling crime? And I thought what would happen is that we'd get a bit of traction, and then over the course of the period building up to the PCC elections in May 2024, Police and Crime Commissioner, we'd be able to get some change. But it took off. I mean, we got 2,500 media mentions in 6 weeks. I did BBC Breakfast, I did 5 Live, I did the Today programme, I did Good Morning Britain, I did This Morning, I did ITN, I did Channel 5, Channel 4, LBC, literally everything, as well as print media, local media. And it really took off. And at the time then, others came in behind us, John Lewis, Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's, all came in behind us. And I think we shifted it. And I think the data, fundamentally the data about police response made it untenable. And I think in credit to the government and in credit to Chris Philp, who's the policing minister, he's shown real energy on this, as has Kevin Holland-Rake, who's the retail minister. And they really pushed for solutions. And then, as you say, we had the police published the Retail Crime Action Plan in 23rd of October this year. And that said they were going to do the things we'd asked for. But we don't stop, because words are one thing, you've got to have action. And fundamentally today in one of our 2,500 co-op stores, 4 or 5 of my colleagues will be attacked. 100 and some will be abused. Some of those attacks will include a weapon. There'll be 1,000 incidents, including organised looting. We'll have people coming in with bags, with wheelie bins. So we've got to make sure that plan is action. But I think what's absolutely true is that combination of data, of images, footage, and then of voices is really worked. And yes, we did all the public affairs stuff, but actually the co-ops press team led by Russ, my colleague Russ Brady, did a phenomenal job at getting us a platform. And I think you've got a really good example there of where you have a public affairs ask and the traditional public affairs, letters. We've got 50, it's us Doors Respect from Shop Workers Week as recording this, Farzana. We've got 50 plus MPs and PCCs coming into our store to hear the stories. All that good old fashioned traditional public affairs work. Combine it with top quality PR work, and suddenly we're on the front page of the Times. we're on. We've got a ITV Tonight programme all about it. We're on Panorama, etc., etc. So the combination of the two can drive real sustainable change. But we've got somewhere. We've got a plan. The police are committed to it. We now have to make sure that that's delivered and that my colleagues are safe and all shop workers are safe.
Yeah, well, I guess it's the holy trinity of campaigns. It's data, voices, and images, and that's actually that works well in seeding through the media, through socials. Now, what I wanted to understand is I read, I think in the news last week, that a retailer up north has started to sort of move away from the automated self-service tills and then moving back to cashiers. Do you think more retailers are going to move back to cashiers? Do you think what's actually driving it is not the sort of, well, actually, we care about our customers and we just want them to make sure they have a nice chat at the till? Do you think actually it's just the rise in organised retail crime?
I don't. So I think there is clearly a risk with a self-service till that people might slip in a few extra things that they're not paying for. That's not behind the 43% rise we've seen. For the co-op, we have self-service tills, and we're a convenience business. People will often pop in and buy a meal deal or bits and bobs, and actually the self-service tills is great for them because they can come in, they can do it quick, and they can get out. But equally, we're a community retail, so all our stores have colleagues manning tills, and that's really important because we're often, I remember when we did a campaign on loneliness, the feedback from some of our colleagues was that there's often people who come into our stores and it's clear the only people they speak to all day is our colleagues. So we'll always have colleagues manning tills, but we'll also, I think, continue with the self-service tills because lots of our members and customers like the convenience and speed that they get from that in a convenience environment. And we don't think that's the reason that, we've seen a 42% rise. There's 1,000 incidents. It's going to cost us £75 million in lost product this year. It's going to endanger colleagues. That's not what's driving those particular crime outcomes.
So I see your fingerprints in many campaigns. Marcus Rashford, and my God, he just burst onto the scene and just made so many of us so proud. And when I was doing a little sort of digging, I uncovered that he sent out a tweet asking for advice on who he should speak to in the government. And what a wonderful story! You spotted the tweet, you responded, and then tell us what happened.
So I'm a Manchester United fan. I follow Marcus on Twitter, and I saw his tweet. I thought, well, I can help. So I tweeted him back. I then got a DM back from Marcus saying, please speak to Kelly Hogarth. Obviously, that I screenshotted that message from Marcus Rashford and sent it to my other Manchester United sporting friends and say, I've got new friends. You're not my friend anymore because Marcus is. Look, Marcus's impact was phenomenal, and I think it was built fundamentally on his authenticity. He was apolitical from the start. It was authenticity that said, I know how this feels like. It was also, by the way, I think it was a story of his mother and his mother's love and the things his mother did for him and his brothers. What was my role? I spoke to Kelly, who again is a force of nature. Kelly Hogarth is genuinely remarkable, and the combination of her and Marcus is quite.
And remind me, so Kelly, she's an agent, or
she's a common specialist. Kelly, she runs her own organisation called Thelma Gwen, and I think Kelly is, as I said, a force of nature. My role, whatever Marcus achieved because he was a powerhouse, as was Kelly. My role was just to provide that little bit of input and advice that said, this is the way it'll work. This is what you might want to think about. I can take no credit for what Marcus did. I'm delighted that I was able to play a tiny role in just adding a bit of public affairs nerd knowledge into what Kelly and Marcus were doing. Because I think what Marcus achieved was remarkable. I think he, in the space of 7 weeks, he did a major. And I was going to one of the co-op runs 35 academy schools throughout the north of England. And I was on my way to one of our academies to do a interview for Sky on free school meals. Because the co-op were, regardless of what government would do, we were funding free school meals during the pandemic for the kids in our schools. And by the time I got there, I got a phone call from my boss saying, "You can't do the interview." I said, "Why not?" I said, "Because they've just U-turned." I said, "They can't have U-turned. He only started 3 weeks ago." He said, "They've U-turned." I remember when he did his parliamentary petition. It went live at 7:00, and I remember Kelly saying it's live. And by 9:00, it had 100,000 signatures. By the end of the day, I think it had 1 million. And that's down to Marcus. But again, it's about assets. What asset did Marcus have? He had his voice, his authentic voice, and he had a platform with millions of users, and he used them for good. And he got some criticism at the time from some. I think absolute bonkers. I think he's someone we should be proud of, and as a fellow Manc, I'm very proud of him.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some people are quite dismissive, saying, "Oh, stay out, stay in your lane." And actually, I think anybody, we're all citizens, and it's not just left to the role of campaigning charities and politicians to make positive change. So I think he was absolutely extraordinary at what he pulled off. Now, in terms of, now you're obviously spent your entire career working in public affairs and communications. I wanted to just get a little feel of who do you admire? Who's a communicator that you admire the most? It could be past, could be present. Doesn't have to be a PR or a PA or politician. It could be anybody. Who do you think has the ability to communicate and influence?
I think there's moments that I've seen people do things. So I remember Obama's speech in Denver when he won his first election. I think he's a masterclass in how you tell a story to make a point. I think Kinnock used to do the same. You said it could be past or present, so I'm gonna win an award here for this podcast. In that, I would say the person that has always struck me as really telling was St. Francis of Assisi. So that's back to the 13th century. He died in 1226, St. Francis. And the reason I say it is that the way Francis communicated, because as you said before, I did a PhD and the proclaims of the Second Franciscan Order, so I know a good bit about St. Francis, is he used the medium of the day. He was often called God's troubadour. And of course, troubadour was the pop culture of the day. Francis is famous for his canticles to Brother Sun and Sister Moon. I guess the point is he used the structures and the culture of the day to communicate. And I think when I look at what the good communicators that I've seen, they've used stories and they've used what's around them. And I think today that can allow you to get beyond a bubble. And I think with the echo chamber that is social media, I think being able to speak in ways that resonate is what is impressive. And I think, what Francis did in number in the 1200s isn't going to work in the UK in the 21st century. But the idea of speaking in the culture and zeitgeist of the time is what is good, is what works. So it's not quite. I'm not sure I admire him most, but I think it's a real lesson for all of us who make our living by helping people to communicate or communicating. Is you've got to do it in a way that resonates because it uses the structures of the day.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I don't know an awful lot about Francis of Assisi. I'm going to do some research and Google. And incredible to hear that he was a pioneer. We often think about pioneers and innovators as sort of our tech sort of giants coming out of Silicon Valley, but actually it's throughout human history, our evolution has been through pioneers across the centuries, and actually we can learn and take away a lot from their lives and apply them. So, in terms of career advice for your younger self, what career advice would you give your younger self, or to those people who are listening, who are starting out in their careers? You've obviously had decades of experience in understanding how to navigate institutions, how to build award-winning campaigns, how to live a life and a career aligned to your values, being aware of what your red lines are. What wisdom do you have to share?
Whether it's wisdom will be for other people to judge, I guess, but I'll give it a go, Farzana. If I was speaking to my younger self, I would say patience. I think you're in a rush, and as a result, you sometimes think the minutiae is important, and sometimes it is, but sometimes these things will come out. So I think patience is a really important thing. I think the other thing is to decide what you want to achieve and what's important. It is those red lines. We all describe ourselves in different ways and at different times in different ways, actually. I always think of myself in one sense as an excise man, because that's where I grew up in Her Majesty's Customs and Excise. Professionally, that's where I grew up. And there's been some really famous excise man, Robbie Burns, who was an excise man, but also a guy called Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine was an excise man. He then moved to America, and he was the intellectual founding father of the American Revolution, a very famous book called Common Sense. He had a phrase that I was shown when I was about 26, 27, I just joined Customs and Excise. And the phrase that he had was, we have it in our power to make the world anew. And I think if I think of my career, that really struck with me, that no matter do not underestimate the impact that humanity can make on itself, positive and negative. And I think having an idea as to what you want to achieve and not losing that ambition, I think is really powerful. I think that's the thing that I would say most to my younger self is, don't lose the ambition to do something, the ambition to be better or create something better. Because I think the danger as you get older, you get more conservative with a small c, you get more cautious. And I think that's the thing I would say, don't let that happen too soon.
Yeah, I agree with that. When I was younger, I was very gung-ho. I'd sort of just do without really thinking things through. And now when I sort of think about something, I almost find myself talking myself out of it.
Yes, there's 100 reasons not to.
Yes. And I sort of admire, people coming into the career because they don't sort of have that heavy baggage in a way. And, I think it helps because we can see, what could potentially go wrong, and we can see if there's a car crash in slow motion. But at the same time, it can sort of, seep away that energy that can propel one to go into something completely new and uncharted territory. Now, PR is considered one of the most, PR, public affairs, marketing, that sphere is considered one of the most stressful professions, mainly because there is a number of variables that are beyond one's control. I wanted to know, what hacks do you have to share with our listeners on how do you stay sane? Mental health is an area that, as we can see from government statistics, is an area that many are struggling with, and especially those, within our profession. So any mental health well-being hacks, anything that you have found has worked well with you?
I mean, there's some things during the course of any day. My wife's particularly good at this. My wife will often insist on doing a walk in the middle of the day. She might take a call while she's walking, and she'll often walk by the local canal, and walking by water just lifts her mood. So there's things you can do in the day, across the day. I guess the thing that I have learned most, and I've seen it from people that I've worked for, is having a hinterland, having something that's not work. So, I'm really fortunate. I've got a wonderful wife. I've got 2 great kids. I make sure I try and spend as much time with my family and my wife as I can. I coach my little lads' football team. Things where you're not, the PA or the PR or the Director of Public Affairs or the Senior Comms Advisor. You're not. You're just a fellow who's trying to teach a kid how to kick a football or whatever it is you happen to do. I think that's really important. I listen to a lot of music. I'm quite tribal in my music. I like what I like, and everything else is rubbish. So if it was done after about 1992, it's crap. Whereas if it's Mancunian indie music or it's post-punk music, the Skids or whatever, it's great. But actually, that really relaxes me. I play guitar badly. I think you've got to have a hinterland, something that if you're out with friends, you could talk about that wouldn't be work. You could talk about music or sport or art or cooking, whatever it is. And I think trying to protect that hinterland means that there's a point where you switch off. you switch off. And when you switch off, that's when you start to look after yourself. That's what I found helps. Always having that hinterland and protecting it.
Yeah. And not only for well-being, but often having an alternative hinterland to work actually enriches your strategic and critical thinking.
Absolutely does. You're absolutely right, Farzana. If I think of the people I know who have got the best judgment, it's the people who've got a hinterland. If I think of the people who ultimately have got not great judgment, it's where they have a very narrow life that is just work. And if it's just work, you don't understand, I think, other ways of thinking of being other things that are important to other people. So I think you're absolutely right. It's not just how you look after yourself. You are better at work if you've got a freshness in how you make decisions.
Yeah, and it also develops the humility to be in areas that isn't within your expertise, as well as empathy and understanding of, different groups of people, which is so important in our world. A huge, huge thank you, Paul. It's been such a treat to hear about your story. I mean, what sort of I take away from the conversation is that you are incredibly mission orientated when you look at your career from the civil service and then moving on to campaign driven work at the co-op. Values and alignment has really shaped your world. And I think that is also very important for mental health, is when you're working in an environment with colleagues where you do not feel compromised, and that alignment is there. So I think that's also a really good takeaway for mental health. A huge thank you, Paul. You have also been incredible, the way that you have broken down the DNA of a successful campaign so successfully and succinctly with just data, voices, and image. I mean, just that sort of simple trio is something that everybody can take away when they're thinking about a campaign, whether they have a public affairs team or not. Now, I wanted to also thank the listeners for tuning in. You'll find this episode on the PRCA's YouTube channel and on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, alongside other episodes interviewed by myself and my co-host, Dan Gold. If you'd like what you hear, please do share so we can grow our community. If you have any feedback or topics you'd like us to cover, then please do get in contact with us. We publish interviews every 2 weeks, so please stay tuned as we have some more inspiring stories in the pipeline. Thank you.